Leaders must discern the right timing for action and trust the process. In most cases, when leaders make a mistake, it's not usually the decision itself. It's usually
you can kind of get the script flipped, and you think this is Abram trying to get what he wants, all the while God is actually...
The leader must ground their purpose, their vision in something greater than...
Hey everybody, before we jump into today's episode, we'd like to recognize all those who make this podcast possible. The Lead Today show is supported by all the generous donors of the Lead Today community. Thank you so much for investing in shaping leaders through this podcast. And be sure to like and subscribe on whatever platform you are watching or listening today. All right, let's jump into the podcast.
Welcome, everyone, to the Today Count Show. This is a podcast about life and leadership. This particular episode belongs in what we call the Genesis Project. We are teaching, or I don't know if teaching is the right word. We are having a conversation through the 50 chapters in the book of Genesis, the book of origins, if you will, right out of the Bible, the first book in the Bible. I don't know that we have a specific leaning other than, how important this book is to answering questions about, where did we come from? What is our current state? Where are we going? That kind of thing. But we also tend to lean towards leadership. So we're in Genesis 15 today, and Winston Harris and myself will be on this particular episode. We sometimes have four of us in the discussion, sometimes three, and in some cases two, like today. What I thought I would do differently before we read the narrative of Genesis 15 is just kind of pull out some of the leadership lessons and applications. I'll do this quickly, but at the same time, Winston, I would just encourage you to jump in. I'll pause after each one, and if you've got something to add, that'd be great. And again, for those of you who are listening, we're just kind of imagining ourselves around a cup of coffee, chatting through this important stuff. So in Genesis 15, there's some lessons to learn. I came up with 6, and I'm sure there's a heck of a lot more than 6. So hopefully Winston will have more to add, or at least some nuances to what I'll share. The first lesson is that, leaders are people too, and leaders need reassurance in times of uncertainty. Visionary leadership is rooted in trust, rooted in faith. And it's the object of one's faith that makes faith relevant. Those are all big words and abstract words, but hopefully we'll get to that. Particularly because the outcomes are rarely visible, right? I mean, that's the whole idea behind vision is it's the first creation. Imagination, gives birth to vision, and vision is that first creation. The second creation, if you will, is the physical. So the application is a leader must ground their purpose, their vision in something greater than immediate results, immediate feedback.
Yeah, I love that concept, Jim, of not settling for immediate gratification in leadership, because to your point, it really doesn't exist. Leadership is a long game, and you must have a transcendent why, a mission that exists beyond your own personal desires. And the way that I've heard it said that's kind of always stuck with me is the higher you go in leadership, or the more responsibility you get, if it's linear versus going up, if you will, but the more responsibility you have, the less personal victories you'll have, the less personal trophies you'll have. And if you're not embracing that concept in leadership of any sort, I think it's easy to get discouraged because you don't see the personal victories or the immediate victories versus embracing the long game, embracing the stewardship of responsibility, and having that, once again, that why that goes beyond yourself.
When you get to my age, I will add that the long game really becomes your friend. When I was younger, I probably hated the idea of the long game because, I was living in the present, the now. But, being a father of adult kids and grandfather, I really I really have to play the long game for sanity purposes. I believe that God is not done with us yet, and He's still working. And the things that He's called me to do, when I don't get the results I want right away, I have to ask the question: how does faithfulness play into it? Faithfulness can sometimes be disguised as an excuse, but if you're doing the right things towards the right direction, almost anything that's worth doing is a long game situation, and that's where I put my trust. So that's good. The second one that I wrote is that effective leaders voice concerns transparently and seek clarity. What we're going to read here in a little bit is Abram, who is our main character right now in the book of Genesis, is really kind of rehashing concerns that he has with his current situation. And I don't know that he's doubting God, but he is definitely throwing out, some grenades as to, I don't have this, I don't have that. And so that's an interesting thing we're going to look at. And there's actually a conversation that we're going to read between Abram and God. And the application would be for us, creating a culture of honest feedback and dialogue. It actually strengthens trust and alignment. A lot of people think that, the opposite might be you're rocking the boat, or you're not aligned, or, you're a rebel. But, our weaknesses and our concerns, I think, do better being brought to the surface within reason.
Yeah, and I love the idea of just bold honesty here from Abram, and how we'll unpack it. But whether in our prayer life or in our teams and in our families, having the courage, to go to the level of transparency and authenticity about like what's really going on, right? Not staying in the surface level space, but confronting the challenges, confronting the concerns, right? Abram is having a conversation with God, and he's concerned about some things that God proposed, and what God said is not matching what he's seeing, and it's a very tangible example that I think a lot of people are going to be able to connect to, especially those who are pursuing God, right? That oftentimes what we believe has not been seen, and we kind of have to live in that gap, and we call that faith. But faith also can be seen in what some might call doubt, right? And that's what we're kind of seeing here with Abram. He's wrestling. He's trying to figure out, you said this, but why aren't I seeing it? And being willing to have that bold honesty to voice it.
And what human likes living in the gap, right? I mean, and so that's that's a very relevant point. I think that this chapter brings out. The third, which will bring us about halfway, at least, to the things that I uncovered. Great leadership requires faith in the process. I mean, it's somewhat of an overlap, especially when the full picture isn't clear. It's a little redundant from the previous, but here's where it's a little bit different, is in the application. Leaders often have to make decisions based on long-term vision rather than immediate evidence.
Yeah, and I think it's figuring out what is our process of decision making. That's the thing that is kind of curious. We all have our ways that we land the plane, if you will, and to get to a decision, to arrive at a decision that is going to move us forward. Or is it going to be indecision, which is still a decision not to make a decision? Right? We're just circling. We're just not really doing anything for the sake of. Some people label it. I'm still thinking about it. Right? People try to put a positive spin on it, but you're really just you're not picking a side, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with that if someone has also clearly articulated a timeline. I think I want to I think I'm going to make a decision on this in 2 weeks. I'm going to make a decision on this on, by such and such a date. This is what I'm hoping to feel differently or know differently or gather or whatever. But you're right, just that constant circling plane. if you've ever been in the sky in a plane and you just keep circling the city, super frustrating, especially if the pilot doesn't tell you what the heck's going on. That just happened to me a couple of weeks ago. That's kind of funny. Anyway, leadership involves making and keeping commitments, often solemn and long-term. Got to be careful about the commitments we make, for sure. The application is integrity and a covenantal way of thinking, like, for example, loyalty, responsibility, sacrifices. Those are rich words, heavy words, but they're the core of sustainable leadership. So leadership is not flippant for sure.
Yeah, and as we'll see in the text, the literal sacrificing of an animal, and that figurative application for us today, I just think leadership is going to cost you something. And if it doesn't cost you something, you're probably not really leading at some level.
Yeah, it's good. All right, we got two more. Some leadership outcomes take time, and that is obviously redundant, and may not. But here's the twist, and we don't like this one, but may not materialize in our lifetime. So the application is that leaders must realize that sometimes what they're doing is they're sowing seeds of impact that may grow or flourish after our tenure is over. Really got to resist that immediate gratification, don't we?
Yeah, it's almost like, reading that and hearing you talk about it, it's almost like you have to develop this internal culture of legacy. Like legacy just has to be interwoven into the idea of leadership, as almost like this accountability value. Like I can't just be leading with a urgency for now or for the next 3 years or 5 years. Like it literally, to some of the theme of what we're talking about, it has to be a long game. But the long game is not even a destination for myself. A long game is generational destination. How do I set up what I'm doing so that it can scale beyond my lifetime?
Yeah, it's kind of like the developing theme here in Genesis 15, even though we haven't read it yet aloud. I mean, you and I have read it, but we haven't read it on this episode yet, is that Abraham is going, what's up, man? And he's living in the time frame of now. And then God says, no, you got to look out farther. But to help him, God creates a unilateral covenant. So sometimes, so now we're learning some leadership lessons from God himself. That sometimes leadership does take on the whole thing. I mean, sometimes we have to, it's certainly not ideal, but there probably are times where you just got to put it on your back. You as a basketball player know that there was probably a time in a certain game, in a certain situation, that you just felt, this one's on me, win or lose, this one's on me. And sometimes that's the way leadership is. Again, I don't think that's the sustainable design for human leadership, but it is a principle I think we'll pull out here. Okay, and then we have the sixth principle or lesson that I pulled out is that leaders must discern the right timing for action and trust the process. Lloyd Lewan, a mentor of mine, always told me that in most cases when leaders make a mistake, it's not usually the decision itself. It's usually the how and when they carry out that decision. You've heard me say that multiple times. And that's because it stuck with me. And that's because looking back and taking inventory, even when you open your mouth to speak, that's a perfect example. Sometimes you just shouldn't say anything. You just shut your mouth and wait for another time, another deal. Anyway, the application is patience and strategic timing are often more effective than immediate gratification. I really want to say this right now. I really want to do this right now. That makes me feel better, but I'm not sure it makes the situation better.
Yeah. if we can close the loop or almost tie back, the very first thing we'll end up reading, where God is saying that He's essentially, He's the shield and He's the reward. He's the protection and He's the provision. That gets tested here in this portion of what we'll talk about, where if we really are trusting God to be our protection and to be our provision, that feeds that ability to be patient and to have the appropriate timing, because we're framing everything through, okay, I'm not having to protect myself, I'm not having to lead out of a urgency to cover my image, or to cover my reputation, or to be the one that's going to generate the resources. Like, I'm partnering with something beyond myself, and because I have that concept, that can help me reframe and slow down, or have once again a better discernment of the timing. So yeah, it's gonna be good.
Yeah, so I know those are all pretty, high level abstract ideas, but now as we read the narrative, we're going to kind of get into the sandbox with Abram, and so I think some of this will land a little bit more practical for us. I'm going to go ahead and start reading through it. I'm reading out the New Living Translation, Winston, and there's 2 or 3 spots where I think I'll pause and let me catch a breath, and then we can kind of commentate on it a little bit. Verse 1 says, now just to remind everybody, if you've been following along with us, Abraham just experienced a huge victory in war. He rescued his nephew and his family and all of his possessions, and he kind of has now become this immediate hero. And I don't know about you, Winston, but I've been taught this, but I've also experienced this. When you go through hard times in your life, you're in hard times. But sometimes when you accomplish something great, you get some big goal accomplished or some big event, and you came out victorious. I don't know what it is, but after you go to Disneyland, so to speak, and celebrate, you get kind of lost. I think that's kind of where Abram is right now. So that's how I'll introduce it. So he had this big victory, and then the next chapter starts this way. Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid." That's weird. "Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." But Abram replied, I'm assuming he's replying in the dream, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son, since you've given me no children?" I kind of like that. I kind of don't. "Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir." I want to pause there just and say this. It's pretty clear what Abram's worldview is. He certainly doesn't believe in he doesn't have an agnostic posture where God is way out there. Here is a biological problem that he and his wife are experiencing, and he's sending that to God's address, that this is his doing.
I mean, to your point, even setting this up, the headspace that you can get into after you take a mountain, it's almost like you're coming back down the mountain, and it's like the mountain never really satisfies. It always over promises, under delivers, and you almost imagine Abram is kind of left with the sense of almost frustration in a way, and maybe God is already kind of, to your point, God's messages, man, great job, Abram. It's, hey, don't be scared. and it's kind of like an odd, like you said, like why would God say that? But then you also have to think maybe there's some stuff that's already brewing in Abram. Like, he just won this major victory over like 4 kings. So maybe there's some retaliation, maybe his mind starts playing with him, and he's getting anxious and he's getting fearful, and he's like, you would think he's, confident and on top of the world, but maybe he's like, man, maybe I maybe I just got through that. Maybe I shouldn't have won that. All of these doubts start creeping in. You start to see that in this conversation with God. Now, I don't have what I think I need. I don't have what you said would happen. Right? It's interesting space for people to get in after what they think they wanted happened, and they're on the other side of the mountain, if you will, and they're kind of wrestling with some things.
Hey everyone, we're going to take a brief break from the podcast to let you know our very own Jim Piper has released a brand new book called Story, The Art of Learning from Your Past. Everyone has a past, but not everyone learns from it. Jim unpacks lessons in this book that help leaders and learners understand the potential our past has to impact our present and our future. Be sure to grab your copy of Story where books are sold. All right, let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, I think in my life, I've learned how fast you can go from a hero to a zero, whether it's in the public eye or in your own or both. It is an interesting experience in life. So, I left off there where he says, so, this dude that's in my house is going to end up taking all this stuff. And so then in verse 4, it says, then the Lord said to him, nope, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram outside. Is this still in the dream? Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. And verse 6 is a popular verse in the Bible. In this New Living Translation, I don't remember it in this way because of the paraphrasing of this, but and it's quoted, in the New Testament. But it says, and Abram believed the Lord. He believed God. He believed him. And an interesting phrase with this conjunction here, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Then the Lord told him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. But Abram replied, here comes his second complaint. So the first one was a son. O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it? Man, he's definitely got some doubt going on, which, again, is kind of a reassuring thing because that's kind of how I am. One day I've got my sword and my shield and I feel strong and confident. And the next day I go, who am I? Where am I? What is this all about? Verse 9 says, the Lord told him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So Abraham presented all these to him and killed them. He sacrificed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. Just impractical, too small. Some vultures swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abram chased them away. That is one of the funniest verses in the Bible to me. What is the relevance of... So I just saw now in my mind's eye, Abram goes, shoo. Okay, cool. That's something deep there, I guess. Verse 12, as the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep. Is this a deep sleep in his already dream? I'm supposing not. So somewhere he came out of the dream and followed the dream, I guess. As the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness came down over him. Then the Lord said to Abram, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. So now God prophesies, tells him about the future, cast vision, but not the best kind of vision. 14, here comes the but. We're almost done with this chapter. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end, they will come away with great wealth. For those of you listening, obviously we're talking about the Exodus. We're talking about that movie that many of us have watched, on TV about Moses. As for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. There's another note that seems to be out of context, but there it is. I'm going to pause there before we get into this covenant ritual. Any thoughts that you had in this first section, just regarding this dialogue between God and Abram?
We see there is that God's not discouraged by our doubt, that God's not disqualifying Abram because Abram's asking questions, because Abram's having a transparent dialogue. For those of us who are believers, we can try to make our dialogue with God very put together, very polished, or we don't participate in a dialogue with God because we're waiting until we get to a headspace or an inner space where we feel like we can have a put together dialogue with God. All the while, God is wanting to have these kinds of dialogues, these honest, frustrated, questioning, whether you're on the mountaintop or you're, in the, valley, if you will. God is looking to have these transparent conversations. And I think personally for myself, some of the places where I've seen, the most formation in my spiritual life has been me getting transparent with God, learning how to put language to things that were inside of me that, maybe I don't feel like there's a safe space anywhere else, but there's a safe space in His presence to start to put language to. And man, there's this beautiful, exchange where He meets you, like He's meeting Abram and he's responding to Abram, and and God's responding in honesty, right? And I just see this honest conversation on both sides, and that's in the midst of honesty, transformation is happening, visions happening, the future is taking shape. So that this section here, almost like bookmarking it, just like bold honesty, getting real with God, and the idea that you can't change what you're not willing to confront comes up. If you're not willing to actually get real about the things that the questions you have, the frustrations that you have, whether they're right or not right. God is big enough to handle those things, and it starts to he's able to redirect our thinking, in these moments where we're willing to even engage God in this manner. So
I'm glad you said that. I think I needed to hear that, today, because when I rewind the tape of my life, when I have had those what I might call not so reverent conversations with God, I'm not saying this is the magic potion or the combination to the lock that opens heaven's gates and all of that preachy kind of sing-songy stuff. But I can say that I don't think it's coincidence that resolution came after. I can't always say my desire, but in many cases my desire, and in some cases not. And I don't think that's simply a rolling of the dice. I think that's part of a bigger, picture that I don't understand. That gives me courage. What you said, that gives me courage. So here's where we're at in Genesis 15. So we know that Abram scored a big victory. We kind of reading in between the lines that after some time, it says, so we don't know whether that's a year or 2 years, or a month or 90 days. We don't know what the time frame is. But at some point he hit a slump, and maybe that was what we said earlier. He now feels like he's gone from a hero to a zero, or maybe God went on vacation, or something like that, which would not be unusual for the people of that day's theology to believe that God is omnipresent wasn't something that would have been developed, at least in the vast majority. Instead, the heavens were divided by gods, and even those who believed in Abraham or in Abram's God probably still did not have an idea of omnipresence. So even more so, he probably felt alone in that. And again, I'm reading between the lines. I don't know. And then, of course, he gets this dream, and he's got a couple complaints that he's lodging. First one is he doesn't have a son. How can he be a great king and a great leader of the world if he doesn't have a son? That doesn't make any sense. And then the second is, where is this land that you said that we're still in the same spot, we're still raising hay, and I don't see any big walls going up. I don't see any kingdoms. With those two complaints, God responds to both. Says, you will have a son and you will have a land. There will be a hiccup. There'll be a 400-year hiccup. You don't need to worry about that because you'll be dead. Right? So I think we're bringing us up to speed. And then God does something crazy. And that's how we end this chapter. And I pick up in verse 17. After the sun went down and darkness fell, Abram saw a smoking fire pot, okay, and a flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcasses. Just to remind everybody, don't forget about the sacrifice. And he laid those out kind of like a board or a out of bounds line, that kind of a thing, a fence. So I'm going to read that again. After the sun went down and darkness fell, Abram saw a smoking fire pot. He saw that. That must have been weird. And a flaming torch passed between the halves of the carcasses. So the Lord made a covenant with Abram that day. So this was a covenant move here, a covenant act. It was a signing of a document in God's ways, in God's methods. So the Lord made a covenant with Abram that day and said, I have given this land to your descendants, all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River. The land now occupied by the, and he lists all kinds of ites, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the etc., all the way to the Jebusites. And that's how it ends. What is really powerful here is for us to examine for a little bit, what is the symbolism? We're assuming that, we're seeing a smoking pot have invisible legs floating along with a torch, floating between these sacrifices. And we can surmise from the text that this is a promise, this is a signature, this is God's signature, this is his seal, this is his act of promising that these things will come about. But what else is it?
I think there's something to be said for, a God who's willing to make a commitment with humanity here. And, you can kind of see this as Abram being a whining, leader who's not getting his way and he wants certain things. And who is God to, even entertain that? But I mean, the bigger picture is God is working a plan out. And sometimes, you can kind of get the script flipped and you think this is Abram trying to get what he wants, all the while God is actually getting what he wants through Abram. And so God is willing to make this commitment, with Abram. And to your point, I think it's a sobering reality that even what Abram is wanting to participate in is not what he thinks it is. And God gives him a snapshot of that. Like, you think you want this legacy and you think you want all the things that I'm promising you, but you have to know the promise is complex. the promise is layered. This isn't, a fast track to fame and wealth and status. That there's all kinds of nuance. There is literal struggle that is interwoven into this promise, and I'm not going to withhold that from you. I'm once again, this bold honesty, right? I'm gonna let you know up front what you are committing to, what we're getting into, what this contract is going to require. And so I think what a picture of the character of God here. Even the flaming torch and in the fire pot, like how God chooses to literally show up. And you can kind of, if you're a Bible nerd out there, God is continually in the Old Testament showing up as a cloud or as fire, right? As a cloud or as fire. Like there's literal a manifesting of God's presence comes out, a tangible. And that might seem weird here, but in our realities, there are literal, tangible ways we can see God affecting our environments, right? Like the unseen affects the scene. And so I just think there's a basic parallel there. But this God who's willing to make a commitment, willing to enter into.
Yeah, it's really good. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think the smoking pot and the flaming torch is a symbol of God, just like the burning bush was, to Moses. And just so that everybody understands, in ancient days, so what God is doing is he's actually using a custom of the people, and he's engaging in that custom. So when you would make a deal, you would sacrifice this animal, you would and you would walk between the animal as a promise that if you break the promise, it will bring death upon you. So people did not enter into those covenants without clearly thinking through that. And so here is God, he, in a sense, lowers himself to our covenant, and he makes a pledge. Abram doesn't walk through this. God does. So God unilaterally makes a promise. But to what you were saying, Winston, that was another message that says, Abram, maybe you think this is about you, but it's not. It's not. And, I mean, just like when he said, and by the way, your family's going to be enslaved for 4 centuries, but, it's going to come out okay. So I don't know about you. I just thought, wow. And then I think it points to Jesus Christ, that, there's something that the Bible teaches that Jesus has done for us that we could not do for ourselves. I don't think it's a stretch to say Abram could not have taken the new land. He could not have had a son without God intervening. And in the same way, we have a death problem, we have a sin problem, and we can't do anything about it. And that's once again why God stepped in and provided Christ. And really, if you think about it, it's a unilateral promise. We didn't ask for it. We didn't know we needed it. We were dead, and it was God who made us alive. Man, that's a good chapter, isn't it?
Phenomenal.
Well, our next one will be Genesis 16, and I'm excited about that. Thank you for joining me today, Winston, and hopefully the other boys will be back for our next one.
Thank you for joining us here at the Today Count Show. Be sure to like and subscribe on whatever platform you listen or watch so you don't miss any content. And stay tuned for more coming soon.